Senior Staff Therapist in the Office of Student Life Counseling and Consultation Services. He earned his PhD in clinical psychology, and his dissertation focused on predicting the risk of depression and anxiety disorders in college students using data from social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. Please help me welcome Dr. Ryan Hansen.
Wonderful to get a chance to come out and talk about something that I really love and am really passionate about. So, just a little bit about me. So I came out to Columbus to go to Ohio State to get my PhD in clinical psychology. Actually just finished up in May, so I'm kind of a newly minted therapist. I'm not actually a professor. That would be a wonderful title to have, but I'm just a staff therapist at OSU. And my dissertation was on trying to use big data techniques and machine learning techniques to predict who is depressed and anxious using Facebook and Twitter data. So I got 1,000 undergrads to give me all of their Facebook and Twitter data for 6 months, and then fed it into a whole bunch of algorithms, and it turns out that's really hard to do. Was able to recover about 15 to 20% of the variance in their scores on depression and anxiety, which for marketing and big business is great. If you walk into a marketing director and say, I can improve the targeting of your advertisements by 15%, they'd say, let me give you a raise. Clinical work, you need like 60 or 70%, so we're still working on it. So I'm a staff therapist at OSU, so part of my time is spent just seeing college students in our counseling center. And then also part of my time is working on digital interventions. So I have a strong interest in figuring out how we can use apps and other digital interventions to enhance therapy techniques and try and make us a little bit more efficient, a little bit better at what we do, be able to see more people. I also do app design, so I've designed apps for the suicide prevention program at OSU and also for our counseling center, and I'm in the middle of digitizing our drop-in workshops so that we can have psychoeducational workshops that are available 24/7 for our students that kind of teach the mental health 101 stuff that it'd be really nice if they taught it in schools, but they don't yet. And I also specialize in digital addictions. So I see mostly the computer science and engineering students that are struggling with video game addiction or addiction to Facebook, pornography addiction, or all the kind of stuff where digital lives can kind of lead us into trouble. So first of all, kind of going to talk on adolescence and social media. What social media platforms do you all know? Snapchat, anything else? Facebook, Instagram, any others? Twitter. We can just keep going, right? And the thing that amazes me is that this list is just constantly evolving. Like, it just seems like every 5 seconds, even like, as somebody who researches this area and as somebody who works in with college students, so they keep me updated pretty well. It's just like every 5 minutes there's something new that the kids are on these days, right? Facebook was the big thing that I researched for my dissertation, and it is still like the biggest platform. These are actually now old stats. This was stolen from my dissertation defense. But one of the things that is interesting is, are your kids on Facebook anymore? Not really, right? Facebook is still growing, like numerically. But it's also amazing how, as everybody's parents and grandparents got onto Facebook, then the kids either like left as a mass exodus, or they've changed the way that they did Facebook. So before they would just kind of like spew all of their thoughts and feelings and post all of their drunken pictures and everything else on Facebook, right? Now it's less kind of like a stream of consciousness and more of a kind of trophy collection of kind of the highlights of people's lives. So it's been interesting to see how even just in the last 3 to 4 years that this big platform has completely changed the way that the people use it. So just from you guys really quick, social media, is it good or is it bad? Has it helped your relationships? Has it hurt your relationships? Anybody? Yeah?
It's good for out-of-town relationships. I think it's good to have family in Bolivia, and that helps me connect.
Yeah. So it's amazing how social media is able to connect us in ways that weren't possible before, and with a lot of people that we just would have kind of drifted off from.
So a few years ago, I did make a Facebook account so I could keep in touch with my parents and cousins in India. I deleted it last week. I said, I don't want to know, I don't want to keep checking, nothing is happening. Who's making this dish, who's doing this, so I just deleted my account.
It can be helpful and sometimes it can just be a burden, right? So I'd like to do an interactive activity because statistically 78% of you guys are on Facebook and more of you are on other platforms, right? So take a second and notice how you're feeling. Just kind of check in with yourself. Are you in a good mood? Are you in a bad mood? How happy or sad are you feeling? How connected or isolated are you feeling? How successful are you feeling? And take out your phones. Actually, take out your phones. Exercise that I do with a workshop that I do with our college students. And view at least 20 posts on the social media platform of your choice. Just kind of notice what's happening in those feeds and screens. Notice what's happening about how you're reacting to those. Just give you guys a second here. Kind of wrap that up. Again, just kind of check in with yourself. How happy or sad, hopeful or angry are you feeling? How connected or isolated are you feeling? How successful are you feeling? Anybody notice an interesting reaction in themselves as they were watching that feed go by? Anybody?
I didn't know my daughter posted all this stuff.
So a little bit of surprise there. Anything else? Yeah?
I'm annoyed that I'm getting ads for things that I saw yesterday.
A little annoyed. And it's amazing how they can track you through the internet,
And
right?
they're trolling me to buy it.
Oh, yeah. It often annoys me, except for when they're right and I actually like get something and they're just like, okay, yeah, Google, you know me so well. All right. So just kind of keep that in mind as we talk about how social media affects us and how it affects our kids, right? Now, one thing to keep in mind with all of this is that everything I'm about to tell you is already completely out of date, right? So I don't know if any of you guys know much about like how the academic kind of life cycle works in terms of a research paper. So you come up with a brilliant idea, and then you gotta go research it and say like, has anybody else already like figured this out, and is it likely to work, is it worth my time? So you do that literature review. That's probably gonna take like a month or two if you're lucky, great. So then you come up with a study to go find out what nature says about it. And but before you do that, you have to go to the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, which is a good thing, and it keeps us from like breaking people and repeating horrible mistakes like the Milgram experiments and that kind of thing. But writing that up and getting that proved, that's going to take like 6 months. And then you actually do the study, but that's going to take a couple months. And then you got about 6 more months when you got to analyze the data and write up the paper, and then you send it off to the journal, and then there's going to be back and forth with that. And so if you can get that done in like 2 years, you're doing really good, right? Now, the problem is with like digital interventions and apps and social media, like 2 years is forever. So it's like, dog years to human years, is that like 7 years or 8 years, something like that? So like an app year or a social media year is like a week. Like entire generations of apps and social media will like rise and fall and die in the span of those 2 years. So for example, we're just now seeing a big push of research articles that were posted on Facebook. But again, keep in mind, like our kids have already moved away from Facebook. So it's kind of a moving target. And that's one of the problems with the literature in this area is that just the way our system works, it's really hard to stay current with what the kids are actually doing. What it actually says is that Facebook and social media are wonderful for mental health, right? So, people who are teens that have Facebook accounts are less depressed than teens that don't have Facebook accounts, particularly when Facebook was first starting out. Having more Facebook friends is associated with having less depressive symptoms. Social support. You get lots and lots of social support from social media. Kind of makes sense, right? And that social support is linked to fewer depressive symptoms, fewer symptoms of anxiety, greater subjective well-being, which is kind of like how you're doing overall. Facebook use is also associated with greater perceived social support, social capital, social self-esteem, social well-being. So all sorts of wonderful things are associated with Facebook. And keep in mind, this are all associations and correlations. We haven't done very much kind of experimental to see what causes what, right? It could be that the people that have more friends are just naturally less depressed, or it could be that Facebook is making them less depressed. We don't really know. One set of literature says Facebook is wonderful. We should get all of our kids on Facebook. We should have them being on social media all the time. And then there's also lots of research that says Facebook is horrible. Absolutely horrible. What were we thinking? So the more time you spend online, the more time you spend on Facebook, the more depressed you tend to say that you are. It's also associated with loneliness, low self-esteem, low subjective well-being, low life satisfaction, all horrible, horrible things. So this is a travesty. We should be like shutting it all down, banning all of our kids from Facebook. So how does this make any sense? On one hand, it says that using social media is wonderful for your mental health. On the other hand, it says using social media is horrible for your mental health. Turns out in this and in most things in mental health and in science, I'll skip that slide. It's complicated, right? So it's not that it's a good thing or it's a bad thing, but it's really how you use it. So, for example, there are a lot of individual characteristics that say it's good for some people but not other people. So one study found that social media was great for people in depression, except for women who were high in a personality trait called neuroticism. And then for them, it was very toxic. One study looking at new moms found that social media was great, particularly in that kind of postpartum period after birth, except for moms who were perfectionistic and who sought external validation. And then for those moms, it was actually negatively correlated with mental health. One of the biggest findings that's emerging is that Facebook and social media are good except for people that tend to make negative self-comparisons. If you tend to compare yourself constantly to the people that you're seeing on Facebook or social media, that tends to make you feel horrible. But if you kind of have that kind of psychological armor where you don't do that, it actually is a wonderful source of social support. Also, if you're missing out, FOMO, there's actually like a FOMO academic scale. Can you believe that, to like measure FOMO? But if you are high in FOMO, you're much more likely to have negative mental health after using social media than positive mental health. And also one of the things that we're seeing also is that particularly for young women, if you're at risk for an eating disorder, if you tend to make a lot of negative body comparisons, that going on Facebook and going on Instagram can just kind of take that and pour gasoline all over it, right? So it turns out, again, it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but for some people, particularly if you tend to make negative self-comparisons, if you tend to see everybody else's highlight reel and think, boy, I'm a jerk because of that, then it's probably going to lead to depression and be a very negative experience. But for other people, it can be wonderful to connect you with, like, say, family that you wouldn't be able to have that relationship with before. So it's kind of a mixed bag. So social media really depends on how you use it. There are kind of 3 tips that I give my college students when I give these workshops. The first is, if there's a theme from the literature, it would be to connect, to not lurk. So active social media use ends up being pretty positive and salubrious. If you are actively posting your own content, if you're actively engaging with the content of your friends, that tends to make you feel more connected. That tends to strengthen those bonds. People love getting likes. It ends up boosting their self-esteem, right? So if you're connecting, is a lot of times social media can be a positive experience and can be helpful. If you're just passively scrolling for hours on end, it just ends up not necessarily giving you any of the good and giving you most of the bad. So first thing is be active on social media. Second thing is don't feed the trolls. So it's interesting as somebody who is researching social media and Facebook, I feel like a lot of my, at least the algorithms for my dissertation were completely invalidated by the election. It's like the election broke the internet, right? Or at the very least, it broke social media and it completely changed the way that people interacted on social media. But before getting into arguments and having just a lot of instability, it was there, but it was a lot less common than it is now, right? And what we're seeing is that people will get on and get into these long arguments on both sides, where people aren't playing fair, and it ends up causing a lot of anger and a lot of strife and a lot of negative experiences. Because who here has gotten into a very long and involved argument on a social media platform? Yeah? Now, who here, after doing all that, was able to change the other person's mind? I ain't seen any hands, right? And a lot of times, at least when I do that, like that stuff sticks with you. You're like, I can't believe they just said that. Somebody's wrong on the internet, right? And you feel a lot of anger, you'll feel a lot of negative emotions that are just kind of bringing you down. And sometimes it's important to get online and advocate for what you believe in, right? But I think that with a lot of adolescents and college students, they're doing that to a point that's not necessarily helpful. So being mindful of your values, but also being mindful of how much of good this will actually do, and what's the cost to you, and if there might be other ways to live into your values. So connect, don't feed the trolls, and to avoid comparisons. Because research says that people are much more likely to post positive events than negative events. You see everybody that's like getting their PhDs. You don't see all the heck and depression and stress that went up to getting the PhD, right? Or you see everybody that's posting kids, like where their kids, I'm posting pictures where their kids just look like little angels and they're so cute, right? They don't post the pictures of like 5 seconds later when the kid vomits all over themselves. So on social media, it's really important to keep in mind and to teach our kids to keep in mind that you are watching the highlight reel from somebody else's life. You're not seeing reality. And so you have to keep that in mind in the same way that we have to teach our kids when they look at the cover of Vogue, that's not a human being. That's like 30% human being, 70% Photoshop, right? And hopefully that can kind of put things into a little bit more perspective. Kind of a bonus tip is positivity. Because sometimes you need a rainbow butterfly uniform kitten, right? So a researcher named Barbara Fredrickson found that for good mental health, to avoid depression, anxiety, all sorts of bad stuff, you need to experience 3 positive emotions for every 1 negative emotion, right? And if you curate your feeds well, if you connect with the right people, these social media platforms can be a wonderful source of positive emotions, of connecting with other people, of getting good information, of seeing cute little kitten pictures that are going to brighten your day, right? But a lot of times that takes a little bit of a deliberate effort. And then sometimes it would also take kind of working with our kids and kind of teaching them who to connect with, who is kind of uplifting and helping them, and who maybe just kind of unfollow, right? So, how are we doing on time? Okay. So when I do this workshop with college students, most of these are 18-year-olds that are doing this first-year experience, so they have to go to a whole bunch of different talks. We have this wonderful captive audience, right? But a lot of the comments that I've gotten from people during this workshop really kind of illustrate some of these points. The perfect girl on Instagram looks like she's having so much fun, has more followers than she's following, and collects likes in nanoseconds. And kind of by implication, if you're not able to do that, then you're not the perfect girl. I was more critical of myself, of what I posted, of what I had up. Social media was a really easy way to feel excluded. Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat made me hyper-aware of the activities that I wasn't invited to partake in, and less involved in the activities that are actually in front of me. Kind of, again, seeing everybody's highlight reel, and then kind of thinking that you're a lot lower by comparison. You go on social media and only see the amazing things people are accomplishing, but not to see the paths that they took to get there. You feel like you aren't doing enough, not traveling enough, not making enough friends, not working out enough, etc. And it's a double-edged sword. When I'm getting positive feedback on social media, it can help put me at ease, but negative feedback, or lack of feedback, can make me a lot anxious. I am very anxious. All right. I wanted to try and tie this in to the brain, right? It's always kind of sexy when you can present my neuroscience research. Turns out, again, the literature just hasn't caught up in this area. Basically, there's only been 1 or 2 studies that have actually looked at how social media affects the brain. What one study found is that they took people, put them in an fMRI machine, and kind of made like fake copies of their Instagram account. And so they manipulated whether the posts, like how many likes the posts were getting, right? And so when they said, hey, you posted on Facebook, Instagram, and you got all sorts of likes, the nucleus accumbens lit up like a Christmas tree, which is involved in kind of reward and pleasure and dopamine release, right? So on one hand, it kind of makes sense. On the other hand, so my wife has her PhD in neuroscience, and so I always kind of rag on her. I'm like, well, of course, because I could have told you that without the $2 million to do the study. Because anytime you feel really good, your nucleus accumbens, kind of by definition, is lighting up, right? If you were to put me in there and show pictures of, I love Indian food here, one of my favorite restaurants. Yeah, you guys know what I'm talking about. It's like you show me pictures of that, boom, light up like a Christmas tree. One literature that I did want to touch on that hasn't explicitly been connected to social media, but I believe is probably really related, is loneliness in the brain. So it's really interesting how researchers try and study these things, right? Because has anybody ever been in an fMRI machine before? Like, it's cramped and you can't move, and so how do you get somebody stuck in an fMRI machine to feel lonely? Kind of hard, right? So researchers came up with this paradigm called Cyberball, and it's really, really simple, right? So you're lying in there in the fMRI machine, there's a screen, and you have a little kind of clicker down in your hand. And you basically play a game of catch digitally. They say that you're playing a game of catch with these other 2 people. In reality, they're just computer programs, so yes, we do lie to you sometimes in these studies, right? And you would think that it wouldn't do anything, but actually it's a really amazing paradigm to make people feel lonely in an fMRI machine. If the other people are passing the ball and they ain't passing it to you, you think that it's too simple, but it actually works. So it's been studied many times, and other paradigms have also been using this. And this is from a review article by Cassiopo in 2014. And what they found is that the lonely brain, or at least while you're experiencing that, is very different than when you're feeling happy. So physiologically, you have a lot more sympathetic activation, you have higher blood pressure, you have higher HB activation, that's that kind of fight or flight reflex that's going on there. You have less inflammatory control. Your immune system actually tanks when you're feeling lonely. Can you believe that? And also, you sleep worse when you are feeling lonely. And that's connected to differences in activation in the visual cortex, the temporoparietal junction, ventral striatum, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. A lot of those are involved in decision making, they're involved in social perception, and they're also involved in reward circuits. So the brain is different when you're feeling lonely or when you're feeling excluded. Now, Facebook and social media are a really good way to feel excluded, right? You get to see all the fun that everybody else is having that they didn't invite you to, right? Or you bet about a lot of our kids' brains are kind of looking like this when they go on and they see that their ex has now moved on to a new partner and they're so happy, or at least it looks that way on Instagram, right? So I feel comfortable at least kind of pulling in some of the neuroscience on loneliness. One thing that I would caution you guys about, because this is like kind of bleeding edge area, a lot of times when the news kind of gets a hold of these articles, you gotta be really skeptical, right? So a lot of the techniques that they use for neuroscience, it's really hard to connect neuroscience to social media and kind of the digital age. It's really easy to connect it to mice, but it's a lot harder to connect it with humans because we can't cut humans open and study their brains directly. And a lot of the techniques that they use end up having very false positives. So, for example, if you do science, you basically do a lot of tests to see like whether something's there. And you say like, I'm 95% certain that that's not due to random chance, right? Problem is if you say that 100 times, by definition, 5 times it's going to be due to random chance. So you can take a dead salmon and put it in an fMRI machine and use the statistics that they use with a lot of this fMRI research, and it will look like the dead salmon is thinking, even though it's a dead salmon, right? So whenever you see those headlines, particularly in this area of social media is changing people's brains, like wait for the second or third study to come out before you actually believe that, because otherwise you're probably going to be chasing a lot of false positives. Last but not least, because we joke around and talk a lot about people being addicted to Facebook, right? Can people actually be addicted to Facebook? Well, it's a little hard to define. So, from a psychologist's perspective, whether something is a disorder or not is basically kind of boils down to whether it's listed in the DSM. Because basically, if it's in the DSM, it has a code, and then you can bill insurance companies for that code. And if you can't bill insurance companies, then obviously it's not a problem that doesn't exist, right? So the latest DSM was kind of revolutionary because it had the first behavioral addiction, gambling. Before that, you could only be addicted to substances. And they kind of came close. They came up with something called internet gaming disorder, which is kind of like the stereotypical, like playing World of Warcraft for my generation, or like, you know, League of Legends or Dota or Minecraft for your kids, right? And you know, if you're playing that 20 hours a day and never leaving your basement, yeah, you're probably going to meet criteria for this disorder. But it's not really a real disorder yet. It's like in the section for like future study and maybe in the next DSM in like 5 or 10 years. So there's not really a consensus on at what point video games or apps or social media really become an addiction, right? It is kind of the wild, wild west right now in the literature. One thing that makes it a little bit harder to define too is, for example, with the people that I've seen and treated for digital addictions, I've never seen somebody who didn't have something else, right? They were depressed, they were socially anxious, there was something else going on. And the same thing that we see with the physical addictions too. Like I've never treated somebody who was just an alcoholic. They've always met criteria for depression or anxiety or PTSD or something else. And so it's kind of really hard to say what is causing what or what is reinforcing that, right? One of the things that is emerging in the adolescent literature, though, is that sleep tends to be like the biggest moderator of whether digital use ends up being problematic, right? Because sleep is the fundamental part of mental health. If you're not sleeping, I guarantee you're going to be more anxious, you're going to be more depressed, your prefrontal cortex is not going to be firing on all 8 cylinders to be able to keep you thinking healthy. More and more, whether it's because of lights, although there have been kind of some improvements in trying to cut back on the lights, or maybe kids are just staying up to be on social media or staying up to be on apps or video games, but that's where a lot of the damage is really being done in this area. So, that's all I got. Do you guys have any questions? Kind of social media parlance, Reddit, AMA, ask me anything? Yes?
I was kind of shocked by one of the things that you said, and I just want to make sure I got it right, because I didn't get the professor thing right. I'm sorry, I'm kidding.
I'd like to be a professor.
So you said that you need 3 positive things to overcome 1 negative.
Yep.
And when I think of our kids marching through the hallways here, I mean, we have a very positive environment here. I mean, we try.
Yeah.
But there's no way, I don't think they're getting 3 to 1.
It's really tricky. And what Fredrickson did is she basically, like, this was before Fitbits and cell phones. This was like PDAs. She'd send people out and give them PDAs and say, okay, over the next week, it's just going to randomly go off. And you just tell me how you're feeling. Are you feeling positive or are you feeling negative? And so the people that are feeling positive in a 3-to-1 ratio are the ones that are one depressed, one anxious, one stressed. But you're right, that is kind of a hard thing to be able to reach. Other questions? Yeah?
I thought the definition of addiction is not how much time you spend with it or how much you drink, but how much it affects your daily life, like your family life or what you're doing at work.
Yeah.
So just because the child is spending a bit more or a bit less, it's not really the time, right? Although pediatricians say not more than 2 hours a day.
Yeah. So it's tricky on how you define. So she was pointing out that it's not necessarily like how much time you spend on different things that would depend on whether or not it's addictive, but it sounds like more kind of functional impairment. And I do think that that's really important. You know, it's hard to draw the line of where, you know, how much video games is too much, or how much Facebook is too much, or, you know, if you're having like 1 drink a week, is that okay? If you're having 5 drinks in a night, is that the point where it's not okay? As psychologists, we cheat and we kind of go to the DSM and we say, okay, if you meet these 4 criteria, then you are addicted. And we don't have that for digital addictions. It is tricky, particularly with teens, to say, particularly with video games, how much video games is too much, right? For some of these kids, like, being a gamer is an identity. Being a gamer is how they connect with all of their friends, right? That's the kind of the primary way that they are bonding. And so, on one hand, like, you don't want to pathologize normal behavior. And to be clear, like, I'm a gamer and I still play video games and I love it, right? There's also been times where it's been too much for me. And it's also, it's easy to identify in extreme cases. Like, if you were spending 30 hours a week playing World of Warcraft, or you know, playing what all the kiddies are playing these days, it's really hard to function well in society, just the way it's set up. It's really hard to function as a college student, it's really hard to function as a high school student. And so it's kind of easier to see when things are really going poorly that, yeah, this is an addiction. It's a little harder to see before that. Yeah.
So my daughter's not on Facebook.
Uh-huh.
I have a 16-year-old on Snapchat,
Yeah.
which I don't really understand. And a 12-year-old who wants to get on Snapchat.
Uh-huh.
Can you talk about Snapchat, and whether that's good or bad, or I know she's on a
I think, like, the answer so the question was whether Snapchat is good or bad, particularly for your 13 and 16-year-olds? Close enough, okay. I think the answer is it's complicated. Snapchat to me is really interesting. So the whole idea behind Snapchat was, unlike like Facebook and a lot of these other social media platforms, like, Snapchat disappears. Like, it's encrypted, it's supposed to be just between you and the other person, and instead of sticking around for the next 10 years, the messages are just going to go away off into the ether. It's also interesting because they try and connect you very frequently. So has anybody heard of Snapchat streaks? Yeah, so the idea is, like, you have a streak going where, like, I've talked to you every day for the last, like, 2 months, right? And the teens are very proud of how long they've been able to maintain those Snapchat streaks. And in fact, like, letting a streak drop is like a nearly unforgivable social offense these days, right? Now, to me, it's kind of interesting. So one of the things that I skipped. There we go. So one of the studies looking at how much time teens spend in person interacting with each other over time, right? And as you can see, the direct line is people that say, yeah, I spend 16 or more hours with my friends outside of school. And that has been tanking sharply since the advent of computers and cell phones and social media. And the people that say, I spend less than 5 hours a day in person with my friends hanging out has dramatically increased. So on one hand, it seems like, boy, kids are never, like, connecting at all anymore. On the other hand, like, I grew up in kind of, the outskirts of Wichita, Kansas, so kind of in the country a little bit. like if I went to the mall, which nobody goes to the mall anymore, but if I went to the mall, then I'd be able to see my friends on the weekends or something. But it was a very deliberate effort. And I gotta wonder, on one hand, I spent a lot more time with them face to face. On the other hand, like, kids are constantly connected. You know, like, we've been speaking to each other every day for the last, like, 2 years. It's almost like adolescents have formed this, like, giant, like, group collective consciousness. You, like, tell one adolescent something, like, the hive mind knows within, like, 5 seconds, right? So, I don't know whether it's good or bad. It gives you less opportunity to know what they're saying. So I think it's kind of dependent on the maturity of your daughters, how much you trust them, kind of how they're doing socially. Whether I think that online bullying is a very, very big thing, and it's something to be very aware of. It can have a lot of effect on mental health. It also plays into this, what we call the online disinhibition effect, or the digital disinhibition effect. Turns out we're much more likely to say horrible, horrible things online that we would never actually say to another person in real life if we could actually see their reactions. So like, middle schools and schoolers are evil, vile creatures by default, at least to each other. And then you put them online and it just like takes off all the brakes. So, the other thing to think about too is, like, one reaction would be to say, like, okay, we're just not going to let anybody use social media, right? But that can have an impact too. It's kind of like we can look at peacocks. So academically, we can discuss whether a peacock's tail is a good or a bad thing, right? And whether it actually is a valid sign of evolutionary fitness, or whether it's just like making a peacock more likely to be eaten, right? But academically, the debate doesn't matter to the peacock who doesn't have a tail and is trying to get a date on Friday night. And social media has become such an integral way of how students and adolescents connect that almost by default not being on them can be harmful too. So I wish I had a clear answer of being my red light, but other questions? Yes?
Is there an age appropriate for kids? I have younger kids.
Uh-huh.
So is there age for either Snapchat or Facebook?
Yeah. So there are really no guidelines that are out there. There's no empirical basis for me to say like 12 is bad, but 13 is good.
What about 9?
I'm sorry? I know, so for instance, Facebook and a lot of the other websites say like, you shouldn't be using this if you're under 13. But I think that's more for legal reasons than for empirical reasons. It also depends on who your kids are talking to online. If they're talking to grandma online on Snapchat, that is awesome. Or if they're talking to mainly kids that you know and you trust.
I think what we see here is younger kids, like 8, 9, going into social media platforms and they're starting to get their friends into it, and then how do you...
And it just kind of snowballs, right?
Could you repeat the question?
So she was saying that a lot of times, like at 8 or 9, like kids are starting to get on social media, and then they're pressuring their friends to get on, and everybody snowballs. And you don't want to be the one kid that's not on social media at that point, right? So again, it's really tricky. I think a lot of it depends on kind of parental involvement and vigilance. So how much you are involved in the social media platform with them, even though they're going to hate them, right? They are not going to let you anywhere near them. But I think if you can kind of teach good habits and make sure that kind of unsupervised chaos isn't going south, that can be worth the pushback that they're going to give you.
I think like what you were talking about, that you didn't have friends nearby. Similarly, in private schools, a lot of their friends are living at, you really have to arrange a play date or to hang out and stuff.
Yeah.
So I think it's easier for them to connect with each other.
Yeah.
And I think boys tend to do more video games, and girls tend to connect more with Snapchat and
It's very much something that we we see. And it's amazing, like, whether, I don't know whether it's better to be hanging out at the mall playing Magic the Gathering like I used to, or whether it's better to be hanging out in Minecraft and building these amazing structures. It's kind of one of those, like, ask us in 20 years and we'll find out whether it worked for screwing up our kids or not.
I was thinking about the brain reaction that you said, the likes, and like a couple months ago, there was a big article, I'm sure you read this, the guy who actually designed the like button on Facebook was going off social media, he's completely got off his Facebook account, they send their kids in Silicon Valley to schools that have no phones, no nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of like this big revolution in the brain center of the whole, creation of this. Are you seeing that at all at OSU?
So what I see really often with my the clients that I work with is that a lot of times we'll talk about going on a social media fast. Because again, like, for a lot of them, there's so much of their lives that they miss out on if they're not on social media. But maybe for like a month or two, or maybe for the month during finals, that they'll unplug so that they're not distracted, so that they're not kind of constantly on their phones and studying for chemistry. I have not had any of my clients get to the point where they're like, okay, I'm going off Facebook and Instagram and I'm never going back. Which maybe just it's like a sign of a societal addiction. I don't know. It is. I do like that idea though. Like, if an entire school says no social media, then that evens the playing field, and it becomes a lot easier for people to not have to worry about that influence, whether it is good or bad, right? It's just a little bit harder when you're the only one that's not. All right, yeah.
I'm just curious about the research that is out there, because I haven't really had a chance to study it, around the use of social media as it relates to just interpersonal relationships. And a lot of kids, even when they're together, they're not talking to each other, they're on their phones. So I think that, to me, that's problematic, because I didn't grow up that way. So we interact, we were creative, we were talking to one another and knew how to interact with people. And I find that young people, college students or whatever, they don't really know how to do that. And I feel like that's a problem. So I'm just curious what the data is out there as it relates to really knowing how to interact with people.
It's really right. So the question was like the research on whether like kids today, because of social media, don't know how to interact with each other. Instead of actually talking with each other, they're all sitting in a circle on their phones, right? So partly, like, the research is just now starting to come out. Like, and first of all, you throw kids into the mix, like people that are under 18, like add like 3 years to that development cycle in terms of studies, because all sorts of extra protections, and you gotta get money instead of like, freshmen, like I can pull 1,000 freshmen and they're free and I get them every year. So it's really easy to do research on college students, right? What few studies have come out have not necessarily supported that kids have fewer social skills than they did before. So we haven't been able to document like a significant decrease in social skills. What it may be is that the way that they're communicating is changing. So for example, as a therapist at OSU, like we have a very brief therapy model. So a lot of times when people come in with severe depression, severe problems that are not going to be resolved in like 6 to 10 sessions, like I refer them out. And I have learned that getting a millennial to call another agency and set up an appointment, it ain't going to happen. Like I have to have them call in my session because like calling produces significant anxiety, right? But how comfortable are y'all in texting? Right? Because for us, that causes about the same level of anxiety. For them, that's just kind of the natural language that they're talking in, right? They just swim in it like a fish. And it's like the difference for me, like I feel like I was just at the end of that generation, whereas my like sister, who's about 8 years younger than I am, like she prefers to text instead of talk, and I prefer to talk instead of text. I don't know whether my sister has different social skills than I do. I know that when she's talking with her peers or when she's talking with other millennials, she has an easier time with it. And when she's talking with old fogies like me, she has a harder time with it. So the question is whether they are worse at communicating, or they're communicating differently than we have? And I don't know what the answer is. And feel free to cut me off at whatever, or are we there, or keep going? Yes?
What would you say what would be some warning signs that we should look for as parents with our kids, using social media?
Yeah. So I would say, kind of going back to the addiction slide, the biggest warning slide is sleep. Sleep is the foundation of mental health, and if you're not getting enough sleep, things are going to go down really quickly. So if they're not sleeping because of social media, if they are just kind of acting more anxious, more depressed, if you're just noticing a change in their affect, you kind of talk with them and find out what's going on. They may not want to actually talk about what's going on. But try and see, are they being bullied? Are they having an interpersonal conflict? Is there any way that you might be able to help them navigate that? I wish there was 5 signs that your kid is addicted to social media, but that really doesn't exist. I mean, I would say it's the same signs that you would find with depression, that you would find with substance use, that you would find with everything else. If they're not sleeping, if they're not eating, if they're not socializing, if they're not doing well in school, all of those are red flags to say something's going on. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for giving me a chance to come.